Hi everyone, welcome to the last webinar in this fall series. We're going to be talking about lifelong discipleship, how to build a sustainable life cycle for church leaders. If you've not joined us for any of our previous webinars, my name is Won Kim. I am helping out with for the Central Conference in helping put together some of these materials, primarily for equipping our lay leaders in our churches, but also for pastors and any other folks in our churches who may benefit from this type of material. I have a PhD in organizational leadership. I teach leadership courses. I've designed leadership classes. I've done some leadership development for companies as well as for nonprofits. But my heart really is for the church, and so that's why I'm sitting here doing this with you right now. So I hope this will be beneficial for you. I hope that this whole series has been beneficial. And certainly if you have any questions, you can reach out to me directly. But for this particular teaching, I see this as a leadership life cycle as one possible way to capture really the entire spirit of the whole series. It's sort of a culmination of sorts. Ultimately, building healthier and more emotionally intelligent and flexible cultures really does require sustainable systems of leadership. And following a healthy life cycle for lay leaders will set the foundation for a healthy overall church culture. So our purpose today is for healthy churches and organizations to take care of their leaders and to nurture their discipleship. And that's really primarily what our responsibility is. Having a sustainable leadership life cycle is one way to focus on discipleship and to build healthy rhythms for leaders and ministries. I'm going to provide just one model today, but there are many ways to do this. So feel free to tailor what I provide to your church's specific needs and context. In the comments along with this video, you should find a link to a Google Doc where you can find extensive notes on what I'm going to talk about, as well as a walkthrough example of a life cycle that you'll find at the end of that document. So I hope all of these things are helpful for you together. I would encourage you to refer to that document as I talk, because my slides are going to mostly be visual, and so it'll help you kind of walk along, perhaps take notes if that's helpful for you. Sorry, I was a little frozen there for a minute. For the agenda for this teaching is to explain the value of a leadership life cycle, number one. Number two, just a brief teaching on an elder passage in the book of Titus to kind of frame this for us through Scripture. And then I'm going to walk through the four different components of a leadership life cycle. And then I'll provide you a guidance to where you can find that sample. I'm going to just allow you to do that on your own time, but I'll just show you where that is. So why a leadership life cycle? Why is this the approach? Well, a leadership life cycle allows churches to value people over output. Caring for people will always be more important than getting work done, and that's so important to remember as we go here. A leadership life cycle allows you to disciple people in biblical and healthy ways, to build cultures of discipleship in which current leaders disciple and develop new leaders. So not all of the onus is on the pastors or the pastoral staff to do that. And then it'll also allow you, a leadership life cycle allows churches to establish sustainable rhythms for recruiting, training, supporting, and transitioning leaders. And those are the four cycles that the components I'm going to talk through in a little bit. Now, if you're a lay leader, this type of life cycle can be applied immediately in your ministry area. You may even be in a position to spearhead implementing something like this church-wide. If you're a pastor, for this type of life cycle, I would say consider forming a committee to explore what a sustainable leadership life cycle can look like at your church, because you want this to be done in a way that's going to be honest to who your church is, so that it will ultimately be implemented in a healthy way. But before we get into the details of this, I did want to turn to this Titus passage very quickly. And since you're watching this on a video, I'm not going to read this for you. I'm going to just say that you can pause right here, read the passage, and then unpause in a second. So go ahead and read this Titus passage, Titus 1, 5 through 7. Okay, so having read this passage, just, what stands out to you would be a prompt question. Now, for me, a few things I'm noticing. The overseers, the elders here, are of high character. They have high integrity. They're generous with their time and with their energy. They're mature in faith. Now, of course, we don't restrict women, single people, or childless people from leading. But otherwise, I would say just the way that the character is described here is what we're looking for, right? Now, this is a necessarily high bar. It's a high standard for leadership in the church, and it should be, because leadership should not be stepped into lightly. But because the burden can be great, we also must support leaders as well. No one's perfect, so we need to make sure that we're surrounding and really covering our leaders. They need prayer, they need preparation, and they need support. And so those are some big takeaways from me. You will get some other things out of this as well, I'm sure, but hopefully that gives you a good scriptural framing for why this is really important. Now, the life cycle that you implement will need to reflect and align with your church's core values. Because if it doesn't, then the life cycle will not be sustainable, nor will it be ingrained in the life of your church. It'll just be something that you put together, spend a lot of time on, but ultimately don't implement. And that would be a kind of a waste of time and really a morale killer in many ways. So you want to make sure that when you're putting this together, that it really is really consistent with the DNA of your church, with the identity of your church, what your church is called to, who your church is. And that's all important groundwork that needs to be laid before doing something like this, before trying to develop something like a sustainable leadership life cycle. And so if that's where your church is, if you've not kind of done those steps yet, I would encourage you to check out the previous videos in this series, because those will help kind of guide how you can start doing some of those pieces, those ground laying pieces, before you would try to do something like putting a leadership life cycle together. Now I'm going to talk through sort of how I've conceived this as 4 different components of what would be a healthy and sustainable life cycle. You have recruitment, you have training, you have support, and you have transitioning. Now these are phases for different leaders, and it's not always going to be a linear process, right? So you want to think of this almost cyclically, because you can really be in any different part of this at any different time. Now you ideally want to kind of be moving through this in some sort of linear fashion, but of course things happen. Leadership has to transition at off times. We can't always be prepared for that. And so not only will it sort of go from transition to recruit and back and forth, but your different ministry areas might be in different places at different times. And so, you want to hold this kind of loosely, but kind of depending on where a ministry might be, you can hopefully kind of figure out where that would slot in. And I think there's some fundamental things from each of these that you can take away that would be helpful in various stages of where your ministries might be. But let's start first with recruiting. In terms of the recruitment piece, you want to think about theological qualifications. So can this person, this potential leader, live in harmony with your churches and with the covenant's theology, the theological stances, the affirmations? Are they informed on them? Can they live in harmony? It doesn't mean there's 100% agreement necessarily, but a willingness to live in harmony, to represent the church honestly, right? And in ways that the church espouses. Are they comfortable doing that? Are they informed enough to do that? Again, not maybe 100% agreement, but at least being willing to live in harmony with those values and with those stances, with those positions. And then there's practical qualifications, right? Are they experienced in that ministry area? Is this person recommended by other leaders and pastors? Have they been around for a little bit? Do people know them well enough to know that they have that kind of integrity and character that that the book of Titus talks about? You also want to consider being upfront about terms. So I would say maybe consider year-to-year terms to prevent burnout and to have opportunities for fresh voices in leadership. It doesn't mean that people only serve year to year or 1 year at a time. But it gives opportunities for off-ramps and also on-ramps for new leaders to come on as well. And just so somebody knows, they're not signing on in perpetuity when they agree to lead a ministry, right? That they know that there's checkpoints and things like that where they can exit if necessary or if called away. Expectations for new leaders. This is really important to communicate this up front. Communicate what your expectations are of them. What does the accountability structure look like? How are you going to keep them accountable on things like Sabbath? Remember, people over output. We want to make sure that people are in a position when they're being asked to step into leadership that they're able to, that they're not being overworked, right? That they're in a position in their lives where they can take Sabbath and that they're able to do that and have margin in their lives. Otherwise, I would say, I don't know if it disqualifies people, but that's certainly something where they're going to have to consider just why they're so busy and why Sabbath is not a regular part of their lives. And having margin is not part of their lives. So that's a more important conversation than whether they're a good fit for this particular ministry area. There might be some pastoral work that might need to be done even before that. Moving to training or orientation. Once you've recruited your leaders, you need to make sure that they're all on the same page with you, with the church, in terms of what's expected of them, in terms of what it means to lead in their respective areas. So having an orientation can be really helpful to build community also amongst those new leaders. So as a new leader, you're not feeling like you're on your own, but you have a community of folks that you're kind of starting with as well. They may be leading totally different areas, but at least they know they're not the only one kind of starting fresh and feeling kind of on an island. During an orientation, you'll want to provide an overview of the covenant affirmations, of church values, again, to make sure that they can live in harmony with those things. You want to review expectations of what it means to be a leader at your church. I recommend using the Emotionally Healthy Leadership book by Pete Scazzaro as a model. It's really helpful. It infuses biblical principles, emotional intelligence, as well as other helpful practices. And then maybe provide a brief training on personal discipleship. So what kind of spiritual rhythms can they be implementing in their lives to make sure that they're being nourished by the Holy Spirit? What does communal discipleship look like? Are they part of the church's regular discipleship rhythms? Whether you have small group Bible studies or all church Bible studies or other cell groups, that type of thing. Are they regular part of community and discipleship at your church? They need to be as leaders. And then leadership skills. You might, if you feel equipped to do this, maybe provide sort of a crash course on some leadership skills like team building, like how to delegate and empower. Some churches might be more inclined or have more sort of equipping in this area to do something like Strength Finder, something like that, just a helpful tool to help leaders sort of assess themselves, understand where their strengths and weaknesses might be. Moving towards support. It is really critical at this juncture to care for our leaders and to make sure they're being poured into. And I say this over and over again, and I've said it over and over again, and I will say it over and over again, but people over output. It's so important to value our people, to disciple our people, to love our people, our leaders, for more than just what they bring to the table in terms of their skills and their gifts, right? We want to love these people and we want to nourish them and care for them. So I recommend meeting quarterly with leaders. Have different ministry staff provide support. Check-in questions, these come from Emotionally Healthy Leader. These can be helpful. Take them or leave them, but I think that can be helpful. Questions like, how is your married or single life? And are you leading out of your marriedness or singleness? Now you can read the book Emotionally Healthy Leader to get a little bit more background on what that means if you've not read it before. How are you practicing Sabbath? Note the question's not, are you practicing Sabbath, but it's how are you practicing Sabbath? Because the assumption there is that you are practicing Sabbath. And how is God forming you through Sabbath? Number 3, what are some next steps or upcoming projects that you have coming up? Because it could be ministry related, it could be personal, it could be professional, other things they've got going on. It's a good check-in point, kind of see where people's heads are at. How would you describe the culture of your team? Some people may not even have an idea what that means. We want to get them thinking about what kind of culture is being created in their ministry teams. How can we be more intentional about creating a culture of discipleship and of Christian formation in your ministry team? What does that look like? What does it mean to support each other? What does it look like to do life together to some degree? What does it look like to fulfill their ministry areas, but in ways that are also promoting discipleship? Number 5. Lastly, have you identified any potential leaders? And you'll want to discuss ways to delegate and empower at this time as well. Because you always want to, even if you know this leader is going to be around for a bit, it's always important to build that culture of discipleship, build that culture of others kind of stepping up and taking ownership and taking on leadership roles, especially those who are eager to do that. We want to give them opportunities to be able to express those gifts in the church. So what does it look like to delegate, to empower? Lastly, if it's appropriate at that particular meeting, if the leader you want to see if the leader wants to continue leading for another year, I would say around the 9-month mark is a good time to make sure you check in, and have a good sense for where that person is, because that will still give you some time to identify a potential leader to kind of step in and give time to orient that person and have a smooth transition, right? To the extent that that's possible. So you always want to be planning ahead. Now, obviously, there's always going to be times when someone needs to step away in an emergency, something comes up, and that's, of course, that's going to happen. And all the more reason then in those instances that it's important to have some folks who've been empowered a little bit and know and can kind of step in a little bit more smoothly to take over a team. And then the last stage here is transition. Assuming that the leader believes it's time to move on to something else, it's really important to help people leave well, right? We don't want people feeling burnt out and leaving, or being upset at the church about something. We want to help people leave well. So number one, you want to thank them publicly. And this is appropriate to do. Celebrate their service. If they want to be, if this is the type of person who would really appreciate being acknowledged publicly, maybe being brought up to the front or on a Zoom or whatever, having them come up, have them show their face. Great, do that. If someone would prefer something quieter, then it's gonna make sense. Depending on who it is, the personality of the leader, how to thank them will sort of be dictated by that. You also want to help these exiting leaders determine or discern what's next for them. Are they going to serve in a different area? Are they going to take a sabbatical from serving for a while? So I want to make sure that they're feeling cared for as they leave. Care for the whole person, and really help them to feel really appreciated for what they've done and also for who they are. Now at this time, it'd be a good time for you to kind of, if you're following along in that Google Doc, and I hope you have been, to zoom kind of down to the end. And the last few pages there are a walkthrough example, and this is basically what we use at my church, and it'll give you kind of a fleshed out example of how this sort of works. Now again, you want to contextualize this, so you don't want to just take this and apply it to your church directly. But it hopefully will give you a good start as for what can work for your church. So feel free to go ahead and use that and share that as is helpful. I just want to share some last and sort of final recommendations that don't really fit neatly into any of the four sort of categories that we talked about, or the components. But I would recommend having all leader meetings. These are really helpful for a few reasons. Number one, they're helpful to discuss any big changes or initiatives that might affect multiple ministries. It's always helpful to get people and teams on the same page, and kind of talking across the aisle, so to speak, to make sure everyone's on the same page. And if they know it's going to affect this team, then it can also affect this team in ways that may not always be obvious. So it's always helpful to have a larger discussion. Number two, it's a good chance at all leader meetings to discuss specifics on how each ministry contributes to that year's strategic plan. Or whatever big initiatives that are going on, just making sure teams are on the same page, kind of pulling in the same direction, asking questions, that type of thing. And then lastly, those are opportunities, these meetings are opportunities for you to thank exiting leaders and also to welcome new leaders. Now, you don't want to do these meetings too frequently. You'll probably get lower attendance. You want to do them maybe 2-3 times a year. At pivotal markers, so maybe at the end of your ministry cycle, maybe at the beginning of the next one. For us, we tend to follow an academic calendar year, so we'll do a meeting in the fall, do a meeting, later in the spring, early summer, that type of time. Just sort of as capstones, right? A capstone at the end of the cycle, and then sort of a fresh start at the beginning of a new cycle, to get leaders on the same page, kind of thinking in the same direction. Leader cohorts can be a possibility. This may not always work, so this isn't something that's a must. I would say the all leader meeting is probably a little more important than this. But if you find that a leader cohort, it can be small, maybe just for new leaders, could be helpful, just so they have a place where they can kind of go to other new leaders with questions or concerns. And certainly you want somebody from like a ministry staff to be part of that, just as a support person. But the cohorts can be helpful because these can be built-in support for leaders. It builds community. They can learn from each other. There's a lot of advantages, but it's also one of those things, if you don't kind of sketch out clearly what the objectives are, then they can kind of fizzle kind of quickly. So these have to be done a little bit carefully. And then my last recommendation is to have a leadership development strategy. You want to be developing a healthy culture around leadership. So depending on the culture of your church, maybe reading a book together as leaders makes sense and would be helpful. Maybe focusing on maybe more targeted things like developing particular competencies or skills that you're noticing that there's some gaps that folks would benefit from. Things like targeted trainings can be helpful in that respect. So maybe folks are having trouble figuring out how to empower the leaders or how to get participation, right? You can maybe have some specific workshops around how to do those things. Using tools such as Strengths Finders, as I mentioned earlier, can be really helpful. Other developmental tools are certainly available that might be attractive to your church. These can be really helpful tools to get people to be reflective about themselves, but ultimately to be reflective about how they can serve each other better, right? These tools are not meant to just be sort of navel-gazing exercises where we just learn more about ourselves. No, ultimately these are about God and about how to serve God's people well. And so we don't want to stop at, well, these are my strengths or this is my Enneagram number. We want to be considering, well, what does that mean then in community? What does that mean in terms of serving the church? What does that mean in terms of the kingdom of God, right? And so we never want to stop just at ourselves. Lastly, just if there's individual workshops or ideas that come up, you want to make sure that they align with your overall strategy. What is your overall strategy of how to develop your leaders, how to take care of your leaders, how to nurture them well? And so I'm hoping that the life cycle will kind of build some structure for that. But again, there's things that you can do kind of sort of as accompaniments to that. And if you do, though, you want to make sure that they're aligned with your overall strategy and with the overall identity of who your church is. I have a list of discussion questions here that may be helpful for you to consider. These can be more reflection questions in this setting. So think about your church's values. How do they inform how you would approach caring for your leaders? What kind of gaps exist in your training of your leaders right now? What gifts exist? You don't want this to all be on either existing lay leaders or even on your pastors, right? You want to spread the wealth here. So if there's folks in your church who have gifts in these areas, a teaching gift, somebody who has some expertise with some competency area they think would be really helpful for your leadership body, this will be a good way to kind of figure that out and reach out to that person, help them feel more included as well. Because ultimately this is about building a culture of discipleship, cultures of church cultures where people are really discipling each other and sharpening each other, right? Not just relying on leaders, not just relying on pastors to do that work. We really want to, we're the royal priesthood, right? And so we should be sharpening each other and take that really seriously. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you found this helpful. Again, take a look at that Google Doc. That's going to really spell out a lot of what I talked about here. I hope that'll be really helpful in terms of implementation. And you can always reach out to me or to Jill with any questions that you may have. All right, thank you so much.